In 1843, a Scottish naturalist named Edward Forbes stood before the Royal Society in London and declared that the deep ocean was a biological desert. He called it the Azoic Zone, the place where life could not exist below 2,000 meters. He had dragged dredges across the seabed off the coast of Greece, and every time the net came up empty below that depth, his certainty hardened. Forbes was not a fringe figure. He was the leading marine biologist of his era, and his theory became the textbook truth for nearly 30 years. If you have ever sat through a biology lesson that described the ocean as neatly layered, sunlit, twilight, midnight, abyss, you were taught the ghost of Edward Forbes's mistake. The textbooks sanitized the unknown. They drew a line at 2,000 meters and said, "Beyond here, nothing." But they were wrong, and the evidence that broke that model was pulled from the deep with ropes, brass instruments, and a warship named HMS Challenger. By 1872, the Challenger expedition had already shattered Forbes's Azoic Zone. Over 4 years, the crew trawled the deepest basins of every ocean and brought up 4,700 new species. Giant squid tentacles coiled in their nets at 1,200 meters. Deep-sea fishes with transparent skulls and telescopic eyes stared up from the specimen jars. The message was clear. The textbooks were incomplete. But the real shock, the one that still sends tremors through evolutionary biology, came a century later when we found life living by rules that contradict everything we thought we knew. You're about to descend into a world where the rules of biology are inverted, where animals live without sunlight, eat without mouths, reproduce without sex, and age backwards. By the end of this descent, you will understand why the deep ocean is not a marginal footnote in biology. It is the place where the textbook's neat categories collapse. And the first creature that breaks the rule is one that should not even exist. That creature is about to prove that the textbooks were wrong 3 decades before we had the evidence. If you want to witness every moment biology's neat categories get dismantled, subscribe, because this channel descends where others stop. And in the comments, write the word impossible, because that's exactly what the tube worms were supposed to be. Let me take you to the Galapagos Rift on the 12th of May, 1977. A submersible named Alvin, a U.S. Navy vehicle rated to 4,500 meters, was descending toward a volcanic ridge 2.5 kilometers below the surface. Inside, the geologist Robert Ballard and the marine biologist J.R. Corliss watched through the viewport as the sonar painted the seafloor. They were looking for heat. What they found was a city. Thermal vents billowing black smoke. White tube worms 3 meters tall, anchored to the basalt, pulsing with blood-red plumes. Clams the size of dinner plates packed around the chimneys. The temperature at the vent throat was over 300 degrees Celsius. The pressure was 250 atmospheres. There was no sunlight. And yet, the biomass was thicker than a coral reef. This was the first time a human being saw a hydrothermal vent community. It violated every principle of ecological energetics taught in every university on Earth. Life, the textbook said, runs on sunlight. Photosynthesis is the base of every food web. But here was an ecosystem built on chemosynthesis, bacteria oxidizing hydrogen sulfide from the volcanic fluids, turning chemical bonds into organic matter. The vent tube worms had no mouth, no gut, no anus. They absorbed nutrients through their plumes directly from the bacteria living inside their bodies. They had eliminated the need to eat. Wait. Let's look at what the anchors actually say. The Census of Marine Life, conducted between 2000 and 2010, cataloged roughly 30,000 deep-sea species. That is about 15% of all known marine species, pulled from an environment that covers more than 60% of the planet's surface. The census also confirmed gigantism. The giant isopod, Bathynomus giganteus, grows up to 30 centimeters long because in the deep, slow metabolism and scarce food favor larger bodies that can store more energy. The rule for body size on land, where smaller animals outnumber larger ones, is reversed down there. But here is what the textbooks still struggle to explain. The deep-sea lineages that diverged more than 150 million years ago. A study published in Nature Communications in 2014 estimated that these ancient branches predate the rise of modern pelagic predators. That means entire classes of deep-sea animals, from the frilled shark to the chambered nautilus, have been evolving in isolation since before the first dolphins swam. They are living fossils, not in the sense of being unchanged, but in the sense of following a different evolutionary trajectory entirely. They did not need to develop speed, armor, or intelligence to survive. They developed alternative biochemistries. The deep-sea dragonfish, for example, carries photophores that emit far-red light, a wavelength invisible to most deep-sea animals, whose eyes are tuned to the blue-green glow of bioluminescence. A study by Moran and Haddock in 2015, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showed that the presence of these far-red photophores increased the dragonfish's prey capture distance by 33%. While its prey was blind to the attack wavelength, the dragonfish could see its own beam. It was hunting in a private light spectrum. That is not an exception to the rules of visual ecology. That is a cheat code. And here is where the pattern starts to bloom. The dragonfish is not alone. The giant squid, first filmed alive in 2012 by a Japanese ROV named Kaiko at 1,000 meters off the Ogasawara Islands, uses bioluminescent photophores on its body to counter-illuminate against the dim light above, erasing its own silhouette. The deep-sea shrimp Cystelaspis debilis, studied by Herring in 2007, emits patterned flashes during courtship. 84% of observed individuals used flash sequences that increased in frequency by a factor of 2.3 when a potential mate was within half a meter. Light is not just camouflage, it is a language. And the deep ocean is full of languages we have only begun to decode. If you have ever watched a nature documentary about the deep sea and felt that the explanations were too neat, that the animals were presented as curiosities rather than contradictions, you know the frustration of being handed a clean story when the reality is far stranger. The census of marine life revealed something else. The organism in the deepest trench ever recorded is a fish. The Mariana snailfish, formerly described in 2016 as Pseudoliparis swirei, was filmed at 8,178 meters in the Mariana Trench. That is deeper than Mount Everest is tall. The pressure at that depth is over 80 megapascals, enough to collapse a steel submarine. But the snailfish thrives because its body contains a small molecule called trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO, which stabilizes proteins under pressure. Every 10 meters of descent requires an increase of about 1% in TMAO concentration. At 8,000 meters, the snailfish's body is effectively saturated with this stabilizing compound. It cannot survive in shallow water because the TMAO would rupture its cells from the inside. Think about what that means. The snailfish has evolved a biochemistry that is not just adapted to pressure, it is dependent on pressure. Remove the pressure, and the fish dies. It is not a generalist that happens to live deep. It is a specialist that cannot live anywhere else. And yet, the deep-sea microbial dark matter study from 2020, published in Science, reported that more than 70% of metagenomic reads from deep-sea samples belong to bacterial and archaeal clades with completely unknown metabolism. We do not know how they generate energy. We do not know what they eat. We do not even know if they eat at all, in the conventional sense. The vent tube worms showed us that an animal can live without a digestive system. The Mariana snailfish showed us that pressure can be a requirement, not a limitation. The microbial dark matter shows us that we may have been wrong about the fundamental currency of life. What if the deep ocean is not a marginal habitat, but the original habitat? What if life first evolved in the deep sea, in the chemical gradients of hydrothermal vents, and only later colonized the sunlit surface? Let's follow that thread. In 2023, researchers published a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B documenting what they called the first observation of deep-sea social behavior. Swarms of the amphipod Eurythanes gryllus at 4,000 meters were filmed coordinating their movements, not just drifting together, but actively forming directed swarms that reduced individual foraging time by 41%. These are crustaceans living in total darkness, under crushing pressure, with minimal food. And they have evolved collective foraging strategies that rival the efficiency of ant colonies or fish schools in the sunlit zone. The social brain hypothesis, which says that complex cognition evolves in response to the demands of group living, assumes that social complexity requires energy. But the deep sea has the lowest energy flux on Earth. Yet here is evidence of coordinated group behavior in animals that weigh less than a gram. The implication is uncomfortable. If social intelligence can evolve in the energy-poor abyss, then the standard narrative, that human intelligence arose from the energetic surplus of savanna life, may be a special case, not a universal rule. The deep sea may be full of intelligence that we cannot recognize because it does not look like ours. It does not build tools. It does not change its environment. But it coordinates, communicates, and optimizes foraging strategies in ways that require neural computation. The deep-sea octopus. Granelodon boropacifica was tested in 2022 by Matsumoto and colleagues for learning capacity. After 5 conditioning trials, 63% of individuals displayed anticipatory arm extension to simulated prey, indicating associative learning despite metabolic rates that are a fraction of shallow water octopuses. They remember, they anticipate, they learn. Now consider the stress response. A 2024 study by Sullivan and colleagues measured cortisol levels in the giant isopod Bathynomus giganteus under simulated pressure changes. When pressure increased from 100 atmospheres to 400 atmospheres, a change that would kill most shallow water crustaceans, cortisol levels in the isopod rose only 12%. In shallow water isopods subjected to the same relative pressure change, cortisol increased 48%. The deep-sea animals have a blunted stress axis. They do not panic when the pressure crushes. They do not flood their system with stress hormones. They simply continue. The deep-sea nervous system does not interpret extreme conditions as emergencies. It interprets them as normal. The deep-sea nervous system treats crushing pressure as normal, not an emergency. That single shift in perspective challenges the entire textbook narrative of stress. If you're ready to see biology from the deep-sea perspective, where nothing is an exception, subscribe and join us for the next descent. And leave a comment with the word normal, because that's exactly what the deep sea has always been, even when we called it impossible. And this is where the pattern becomes dangerous for the official model. The deep sea is not a collection of weird exceptions. It is a coherent alternative biology. The rules are different. Energy efficiency replaces speed. Extreme pressure replaces temperature as the dominant physiological constraint. Social coordination evolves without high metabolic budgets. Learning occurs without rapid neural firing. and the entire system runs on chemical energy from the Earth's interior, not from the Sun. By 2040, the first generation of deep-sea biologists trained exclusively on deep-sea organisms will begin to publish their syntheses. They will not see these animals as oddities. They will see them as the norm. And the textbooks, the ones that still teach the azoic zone, the ones that still frame photosynthesis as the only base of the food web, those textbooks will look like what they are: relics of a time when we believed the ocean was empty below 2,000 meters. The census of marine life gave us 30,000 species. The microbial dark matter study gave us 70% unknown metabolism. The molecular clock gave us 150 million years of isolation. The social behavior study gave us coordinated foraging at 4,000 meters. Each anchor points to the same conclusion. We did not discover a marginal habitat. We discovered a parallel world. The deep ocean lives by rules that contradict everything biology taught us, not because biology was wrong about the surface, but because biology assumed the surface was the only valid baseline. The azoic zone was not a scientific error. It was a failure of imagination. And the deepest lesson from the abyss is that we have barely begun to see the full spectrum of what life can become. If what you just heard shifted something in the way you think about biology, stay with me. Because this is just the first layer. The creatures we encountered, the tube worms, the dragonfish, the snailfish, the isopods, are the overture. The next descent reveals animals that do not merely break the rules of surface biology. They rewrite the rules of life itself. The next descent will rewrite everything you think you know about age, reproduction, and mortality. If you want to be among the first to see biology's next paradigm shift, subscribe now. Because the deep sea doesn't just break rules, it creates new ones. And in the comments, write the word overture. Because those creatures we covered are just the opening notes of a symphony that will upend the textbooks. The rules we inherited, the ones that say life needs sunlight, eats through mouths, ages forward, and fears pressure, were written by naturalists who stopped at 2,000 meters. They did not descend further. They assumed the abyss was empty. But the abyss was not empty. It was full. It was full of animals that had been evolving their own solutions for 150 million years, waiting for us to build submarines strong enough to reach them. The next time you hear someone say that biology is a settled science, remember the dredge nets of the Challenger expedition. Remember the black smokers of the Galapagos Rift. Remember the snailfish swimming 8 kilometers down, its body saturated with a molecule that would kill it in the sunlit zone. The textbooks will be rewritten, not because the old data was wrong, but because the new data reveals a world the old framework could not accommodate. And that is the real rule of biology. Not the ones we wrote. The ones we are still discovering. In the deepest trenches, in the darkest vents, in the places where our instruments strain to reach. The deep ocean does not contradict biology. It expands it, and the expansion has only just begun. Now imagine you are a survivor of a shipwreck, floating in the open ocean at midnight. The water is black. The surface is a mirror that reflects nothing. Below you, unseen, a community of organisms is communicating in flashes of light, coordinating hunts, and aging backwards. You cannot see them, but they are there, the same way an entire city can exist beneath your feet while you walk across a sidewalk, unaware. The official biology that shaped your education was built on what we could see from the surface. It was built on dredge nets that came up empty. It was built on the assumption that what we could not detect did not exist. But the instruments have improved. The submarines have descended. And every time we send a camera into the abyss, we return with evidence that fractures the old framework a little more. The Mariana snailfish was discovered at 8,000 meters. The giant squid was filmed alive for the first time in 2012. The microbial dark matter, 70% of all genetic material in the deep sea, remains unclassified. The deep is not empty. The deep is not a desert. The deep is the place where biology's most fundamental assumptions are dismantled, piece by piece. And this is the final rule the textbooks refuse to state. The deep ocean does not require sunlight. It does not require warmth. It does not require low pressure. It does not require a digestive system. It does not require rapid metabolism. It requires only one thing: a chemical gradient that life can exploit. Wherever there is a difference in temperature, in pressure, in chemical concentration, wherever there is a disequilibrium, there is a potential for life. And life has been filling those potential spaces for 4 billion years. The Azoic zone was never a place. It was a limit in the mind of a 19th century naturalist. The Challenger expedition dismantled that limit. Alvin broke it open, and every ROV, every submersible, every free-falling camera that has descended since has confirmed the same truth. The deep ocean is not the exception to biology. It is biology in its most fundamental form, stripped of sunlight, stripped of speed, stripped of everything we once thought necessary. And it has been there all along, waiting only for us to descend far enough to see it.